Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt. Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Teresa.
We have begun last week. We studied the beginnings of Muhammad and how he began his life, I guess. And we're going to continue with that story today, I believe, right? We've covered
That's
Muhammad, right. But what happens thereafter?
That's key. What is Islam without Muhammad?
Mm-hmm.
And it was evidently a question that nobody asked, including Muhammad himself. And what follows afterwards is nothing short of chaos and a building of Islam as a world religion, regional religion to begin with, then as a world religion, and much of the seeds of the complexity of this religion are planted at that time. I was just looking over all of this material and these notes, and then thinking also of, if you remember when we did the modern church history, the last several, as we were looking at Vatican foreign policy and the dialogue between Islam and Christianity, specifically Catholicism. You know, when you go back and you look at those, the programs numbers 76, 77, 78, and 79 specifically were dealing with some of these great questions of the Islamofascism,
right.
jihadism, Wahhabism. How do we deal with that? How is the church dealing with that? And of course, at that time, John Paul II was Pope, and so it'll be very interesting to see how the nuances and shifts take place with Benedict XVI in that shift in our understanding of foreign policy. Some things have happened in the last 3 years or so, last 2 years, that would cause that. But I think, again, history is so important for us to giving us that foundation, that grounding, and understanding what's going on, what's happening to us today. We really need to know where all this stuff came from.
Right, definitely.
Yeah.
To have any good dialogue, you have to have a basic understanding.
That's for sure. And also within Islam itself, there is more than one voice as it looks at its own history. And I've mentioned before the book by Reza Aslan,
yes.
No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and the Future of Islam. I'm going to quote from that a little bit later on.
Okay.
Here is a Muslim, very contemporary Muslim, who is looking at his own faith and calling for a reformation within his own faith. And then another book that's very helpful, although it deals mainly with the modern times. This is Bernard Lewis. I've mentioned him any number of times. And his book is What Went Wrong? The Western Impact and Middle Eastern Response. And why he uses that term, what went wrong, is because that's what Islamic scholars are saying. How did we go from being a world leader in the Middle Ages, our science, our philosophy, medicine, astronomy, the whole works, and now we're on the receiving end? How did this happen? And so this book really answers that. And it addresses the whole question of the interplay of religion and society. And the interplay of religion and politics, and what's the role of that?
It seems like that would be a good book for us as well as Europeans. And
oh yeah, oh very much so, because that's right, because the United States really, for all practical purposes, has replaced France, England, and Germany, Italy, Spain, as being the face of the Western impact.
Yes.
That he's talking about there. Yeah, so that'd be a very important book for us. You know, interestingly enough, too, our Holy Father has recently come out with his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, and in the second half of that encyclical, he speaks about the relationship between specifically Christianity and politics in order to bring about a just society. And I use that sort of as a segue because another book I'd really recommend, just out, is by George Weigel, and that's God's Choice. And his subtitle is Pope Benedict XVI and the Future of the Catholic Church. And in the back part of the book, he has a number of items as he's talking about what he sees in the future of the Catholic Church, but he speaks about a Benedictine foreign policy, and he's talking about Pope Benedict, not Saint Benedict.
Okay.
And he sees a subtle shift that takes place under Benedict. Remember, we're going from a philosopher to a theologian, going from John Paul II to Benedict, and a more nuanced sense of St. Augustine, and a nuanced sense of bringing about a just society, how that happens. And so he has some very interesting insights. So if we have a chance, I'll do a little quote from his book also, because he points out, very importantly, that I'm talking about George Weigel here, points out very importantly that we're talking about two huge bodies of human beings. A Catholic Church representing over 1 billion people, and Islam representing almost 1.3 billion people. Between the two of us, this dialogue includes a third of the world population, and if you look at the newspapers and the news magazines, almost all the issues that are going on right now. You know, nobody's paying a lot of attention to the inner workings of Iceland,
Right.
you know, but everyone's paying attention to the Middle East, and so his point is that the Catholic Church has much to offer Islam by way of helping Islam come into modernity, which is also something that Reza Aslan says needs to happen.
Wow. All right.
So, whoa, three very interesting books before us.
Definitely.
Well, again, you know, the question is, what is Islam without Muhammad? And they were to find out very soon. There are many Muslims who were convinced in the last year's pilgrimage, the year before Muhammad died, many of them had been convinced that Muhammad had designated his son-in-law, who was also his cousin, remember Ali, the husband of Fatima, as his successor. We don't have any clear hadiths or anything that clearly states that. There's nothing in the Quran that states that, but many Muslims on that last pilgrimage saw the deference that Muhammad had showed to Ali. If you remember, when they returned to Mecca, Ali was the only one allowed to go into the Kaaba along with Muhammad to bring out those idols and to smash them. And so I don't know that that's a clear sign of succession, but it says something. So there are those who look to Ali as being the natural successor of Muhammad. The big question, of course, is what does that mean? And then there are others who said, no, they didn't see that at all. So when Muhammad dies, what happens then is very quickly, one of his nearest and dearest followers, Abu Bakr, remember, announces his death. Omar, the rather big, flamboyant, militant fellow who had fallen to his knees crying when he heard, those two got together immediately, along with other leaders of those who were supporters of Muhammad. Now, that group is known as the Ansar. Just literally supporters, and the leaders of the Ansar meet with Abu Bakr and Omar in a tribal gathering. Remember, we're talking about a nomadic society here. The gathering is called a shura, and they gather together then to plot out the future of the tribe. Now, the tribe understood is not the tribe of any particular tribe, but rather it's the tribe of God. It's the Ummah.
Okay.
Right? Okay. Well, of which Muhammad had seen himself as the sheikh. Okay. Or the sheikh. And so now we need a new sheikh, is what they're basically saying. And what they decided on was that there needed to be a successor to the prophet. And the term for that would be a caliph. Okay. And Abu Bakr was designated as the man who would do that. He was clearly not a prophet. Okay. He's not even a religious leader. His role was to be as the Sheikh of the Ummah.
Okay.
Okay, as the judge, the dispenser of mercy and justice for the tribe of the people of God. Okay. Later on, they would add other responsibilities. He would be the ultimate warrior, which we'll see a little bit later on. He would also be responsible for all of the justice within the Ummah. So he would have judicial responsibilities too. But in some ways, this is a very different kind of position. It is ultimately very, very different from our understanding as Christians of Jesus then passing on the mandate to the apostles and specifically to Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the sacramental grounding of what that means this is entirely different. Okay, there is only one prophet as far as the Muslims are concerned. The ultimate prophet is Muhammad, and after he dies, no one carries that on. There is no afterglow. What you simply have is someone who is going to act as the sheikh.
Okay.
Okay. If the caliph's role then was to preserve unity within the house of Islam, the Ummah, then there was going to be freedom to worship in any way. People could worship in the way that they would want to do. In other words, there's no authority like in the Catholic Church, in the Christian body. From the very beginning, the Lord's services, the apostles continued that Holy Thursday from the very beginning. We know from the Acts of the Apostles that they gathered together in prayer and also in that sacred meal. We know from St. Paul's letters that this is a Eucharist that's happening. So from the very beginning that happens. There are no directions. Muhammad doesn't leave any directions, any indications as to how this worship is to take place. Also, there is no authority to determine that worship. So as a result of that, you have very early on sort of a cottage industry of scholars of the Quran and scholars of the Hadith. And these are people who are going to gather together. They're going to get copies of the Quran and read it and memorize it and find ways to apply it to their daily lives. They're going to take remember the Hadith, or all these sayings of Muhammad that somebody said, oh, I heard Muhammad once say, yeah. And those are going to be codified, brought together. And so there's going to be a whole, as I say, a cottage industry of these guys, and they're called the learned ones. The ulama. Okay. Think of it as the spin-off of Protestant Christianity. I'm not talking about the big mainline denominations, but the spin-offs from those. We're well aware that there are, I think 27,000 different bodies that call themselves Christian churches.
Right.
And some of them are quite small, and it's growing. You know? And what, in a sense, that's what's happening with Islam here too. You have a holy book, a holy writ, and then everyone gets in there and starts interpreting on their own. As I said,
magisterium too.
That no magisterium, right? Well, it is not a happy campgrounds. Mm-hmm. At Mecca and Medina, things are not going terribly well. While the Shura was coaxed to proclaim Abu Bakr as the caliph, and the events that happen afterwards, we clearly see that. What we do not see is these people coming together and then proclaiming Abu Bakr, the caliph. It's the other way around. There's some arm twisting that happens. But while that's happening, this is so poignant, while that's happening over on one side of town, on the other side of town, you have Ali, ever loyal, deep in sorrow, taking the body of Muhammad and ceremonially washing it and preparing it for burial. Ali's clan, which was known as the Banu Hashim, objected to what was going on back in Mecca and Medina. They really felt that this was wrong, that that this shura should never have taken place. You need to bury the man first and honor the prophet, and then determine what happens next. And so once many of the Ansar got away from the domination of Abu Bakr, and especially Omar, who was very physically imposing.
Okay.
Once they got away from that, many of them went to Ali and said that they had done what they had done under duress, and were very upset that Ali had not been included in the shura from the beginning. Now, this argument rages all the way down to today. As we talked about last time, you have the Shia and the Sunnis. That's part of what comes of all of this. But even at those early days, things are quite tumultuous. Omar, when Omar found out about some of the Ansar turning against him and going to Ali, he went to their houses and took them and beat them up.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And then I guess he got into sort of the spirit of the whole thing, and then went over to the house of Muhammad, and he found out there at home is Fatima, his daughter, Muhammad's daughter, also in grief, and he threatened to burn the house down if she didn't recognize Abu Bakr as the caliph, as the successor of Muhammad. What stopped him from doing it was none other than Abu Bakr himself, who went over and restrained Omar, and then turned to Ali and said, things are going to get really bad if we don't do something. And Ali agreed to keep quiet and not to challenge Abu Bakr's position.
Wow.
Now, eventually he would swear allegiance to Abu Bakr publicly, but it was going to take 6 months before he finally got around to doing it, which, of course, is a sign for everybody.
Right.
So, succession is decided.
Okay.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
You've got then Abu Bakr. Unfortunately for everybody, he dies 2.5 years later. And so now you end up with all kinds of questions again. Those 2.5 years were tumultuous years. And again, they're incredibly important for us to understand what's going on in Islam today, because those 2.5 years were filled with wars. They were filled with arguments over taxation, over tithes. And the reason for this is this. When Muhammad was alive, various Arabian tribes swore allegiance to him, and they were converted to Islam, and he began to learn the Quran and be one with him. And part of that was to pay a tithe. Remember the zakat, a 10% tithe to Muhammad, which then he as sheikh would then redistribute to the poor and to the needy. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, the tribes understood him then as the ultimate sheikh. But part and parcel of nomadic life is that when a sheikh dies, so does his contracts. And so these tribes then considered that after Muhammad was dead, their contract to pay the zakat, the tax to Muhammad, was no longer valid either. On the other hand, Abu Bakr claims as successor that the contract continues. And so what happens then is there is this huge argument that goes on between these various tribes and then those tribes that are loyal to Abu Bakr. Okay. Abu Bakr argues that they had sworn their allegiance not to a mortal man, to Muhammad, but rather to an immortal God, and therefore the relationship continues on and it endures all the way to death and for all eternity. So keep on paying. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of these tribes didn't exactly buy that concept, and so they refused to pay. And so what follows afterwards is a series of wars called the Riddah Wars. It's R-I-D-D-A-H, Riddah Wars. And these are wars by the Muslim army or armies against the Arab clans that refused to pay. It has a lot to do, much more than to do with just paying taxes, or it's not just a pecuniary concern of money exchange. Muslims see this as a step of apostasy, and that's why it's so contemporary to us today. In other words, to go back on your faith, to not pay the taxes, is to go back on your faith and open up the possibility of returning to polytheism, of many gods. If there is no God but God. And once you say that, you have to continue saying that, otherwise you commit apostasy. Okay. And to commit apostasy is the same as treason against the House of Islam, and commit treason against the House of Islam is punishable by death. Mm-hmm. Now, boy, talk about being contemporary. If you remember just recently in Afghanistan, the big question of this man, Abdul Rahman, who had converted to Christianity 16 years ago. It finally came out public just a couple weeks ago because of the custody battle that he's having with his wife, who then rats him. And then all of a sudden he finds himself in jail facing a death charge. And if it wasn't for the United States and Britain and Germany and others stepping up and putting pressure on the president of Afghanistan, Mohammed Karzai, that man would probably find himself with his head lopped off. Mm-hmm. And that in a country that just 3-4 years ago we liberated from the Taliban.
Right.
And the irony is not lost.
No.
But this is the source mm-hmm. of that. And of course, he's looking for asylum in other countries right now because honestly, some of these ulema, some of these learned scholars are calling upon their people to, if they see him, kill him. It's like a fatwa against his own health. And this is the historic roots of that. That's why you can go anywhere in the Middle East, and if you're a Christian and you convert to Islam, everyone's real happy. But if you're a Muslim and convert to Christianity, you can be killed. And in many countries, it's done legally, in the legal system. In other countries, people simply look the other way, and somebody comes in and assassinates you. There was a terrible story in Philip Jenkins' book, The Next Christendom, in which he spoke about a Christian family in Nigeria. This is Nigeria, and in a mixed part of the country in which there are Muslims and Christians, and the father of this family, he had 2 daughters, and the father of the family converted to Islam. And when he did, he gave one of his daughters to a young man in the village who was also Muslim, and forced her to convert to Islam. And Jenkins points out that she had fled to a local Anglican church where she was a member of the church, and the church hid her, tried to protect her, and the government stepped in and accused the Anglican minister and the parish council basically of kidnapping this young woman. And so she was forcibly turned over to her husband, which she didn't choose, and forced to become Muslim. It's a one-way street, and there is no reciprocity here. You can set up mosques in downtown Rome, but you can't do it you can't set up a church in Riyadh. You can't even carry a Bible in Saudi Arabia. So anyway, that's part of the grounding, the historical grounding of where all this came from. Well, all of a sudden, Abu Bakr had himself a little hadith. He remembered that Muhammad had once said, and I quote here, "The prophets do not have heirs. Whatever we leave is alms." And having remembered that and now enshrined it into Islamic law, that means that the entire family of Muhammad, all of his wives, now are at the mercy of the caliph, who happens to be Abu Bakr, right? So Fatima and Ali are totally disinherited from any wealth that they would have gotten from the Prophet, and now they have to live on the alms of the Caliph himself.
Oh, man.
You know. Now the other wives evidently were pretty well taken care of, especially one, that's Aisha. Remember last time around, she's the little girl who was betrothed to Muhammad, and there's that big controversy about, but remember she was betrothed but not married until she came into her adulthood. She's the daughter of Abu Bakr.
Oh. So
Yeah.
she didn't go to just anybody.
No, no, and she was very well taken care of. You know, family does that sometimes. So as a result, you have a greater tension between, again, Ali on the one hand and the Caliph on the other. And to make things worse, before Abu Bakr died, he designated the next Caliph. There's no shura involved here. He designated Omar as the next Caliph.
Oh, okay.
This is going to be a decision that will have world historic outcome. You know, when you think about it, it's just pure speculation, but when you think about it, if Islam had been led, the Muslims had been led by Ali, rather than Abu Bakr and then Omar, probably you would have had a very peaceful religion. When I look at his life, I just admire this man. You know, everything he did in his life and the way he dies, I think is going to show us that too. He's a man of peace and solid integrity, and a real, you know, as they say in Yiddish, he was a mensch. You know? And I think that probably you would have had a quiet, peaceful religion, but also probably would never have gotten outside of the Arabian Peninsula. It would have been something of an anomaly. We'd be talking about Islam the same way we do today about Zoroastrianism.
Right.
You know. Well, anyway, that didn't happen. Omar, when he inherits the title of Caliph, he is a warrior. He has fought in many wars. He has killed people. He has beaten up other people who are his allies. He has threatened to burn Muhammad's house down. You know, so he's a pretty rough character. And he adds to the title of Caliph another title also, Amir al-Mu'minin, Commander of the Faithful. And he is. He pulls together an army. He is a powerful military force. And in 634, his Muslim army defeats the Byzantine army in Syria.
Wow.
And now he moves to capture the city of Damascus. Here is the first really important city that Muslims are going to have control of. Before that, you know, Mecca's a little town, Medina's a little town. Now you really have a real city, and it's in Syria. That's big stuff. Then, after having bloodied the Byzantines, he then turns on the Persians and attacks the Sassanid dynasty in Persia. Then he turns around again, comes back to the Byzantine areas, and conquers Jerusalem. He doesn't stop there. His armies continue marching down through Jerusalem, down through the Gaza Strip, over into Egypt, and he conquers Egypt. And then from there, continues his armies and conquers all the way to the west to Libya. Now, the Muslim Empire, what had been in the little basin of Mecca, now has spread out all the way into present-day Iraq, Iran, to the east, to the north, up into Syria, into present-day Israel, Palestine, Egypt, even as far as Libya. This is all under this one man.
Wow.
And there's going to be a taste to continue this. Now, what happens is that he then reorders his empire into provinces, and each one is handed over to an amir, a commander, or a governor, a military governor, and then he's going to reorder the tax system so that everyone pays that zakat, and besides it being a tax that's going to go and support the orphans and widows, it's also going to support standing armies. To his credit, Omar tries to put a Band-Aid on the internal problems between him and Ali.
Okay.
And he tries to get Ali to come in for consultation. He asks his opinion on things. He treats him with respect. He even goes so far as to marry one of Ali's daughters, trying to smooth relations, especially with the Banu Hashim tribe, Ali's tribe, who is still really griping about the whole turn of events now. That's been going on for years. At the height of his power, Omar is struck down by one of his own slaves. It's a Persian, and he's murdered. Now, the leading, the commanders, the amirs, the mukamaks at Mecca, called together a shura, and so they're going to do this thing right this time around. Obviously, Omar never thought he was going to be killed in the height of his power, so he never thought about a successor like Abu Bakr had done. So instead, they have a shura, they come together, and they begin interviewing possible candidates for the next caliph position. And one of those they invite is Ali. They have 6 candidates, and one by one they eliminate them until they finally get down to 2. Ali, and then another man, a 70-year-old merchant by the name of Uthman ibn Affan. And they ask both of these men this question: would you follow the precedents of the first 2 caliphs? In other words, would you not only follow what is written in the Quran and the Hadith, but also would you continue on, building on the previous 2 administrations? And Uthman said yes. And Ali said no, that he would follow only God and his own judgment. Okay, that's Ali. So as a result, the Shura chose Uthman rather than Ali. Again, he's an honest man, Anyway, they end up, like as they say, they chose Uthman. Uthman was a very wealthy man from a very wealthy tribe, and the first thing he did was he went through the entire Muslim empire that Omar had put together, and he fired all of the emirs.
Oh my gosh!
All the governors of each of the provinces, and he replaced them with his own family members.
Ooh.
Yeah, not real good. Then he turned around and he tapped the public treasury, which was quite large. Omar had amassed a lot of money, and he turned around and he tapped it for his own family. So right away, people are starting to have some doubts about this guy. And then he did some really big things. He changed his title. Now, the title that he had gotten from Omar, from Abu Bakr, had been this, the Caliph, but the actual title is the Khalifat Rasul Allah, that is to say, the successor to the messenger of God, recognizing Muhammad as the messenger. He simply turns around and changes the title to Khalifat Allah, the successor to God. A lot of people are a little worked up over this, as one can imagine. And then the next thing he does is he gets control of the canon of the Quran itself. As I say, what happens after the death of Muhammad, as far as scholarship goes, is a cottage industry. Everybody starts making their own copies of the Quran passing it around, and as always would happen, there are certain corruptions within that. Sayings are changed, and all that sort of thing. And what happens is that in 650 A.D., Uthman commands that all copies of the Quran throughout the entire Muslim world would be collected in Mecca. They would all be brought to Medina. They would all be brought to Medina, and then they would be all studied, and any variance from the canon that he chose would then be burned. And after that, other copies would be made of the Quran that were according to his canon, Uthman's canon, and those then would be sent out to the world. Now, here we have a lot of very heavy-handedness on the part of the third caliph. Mm-hmm. Some of it has to do with taking public money for his own family. Some of it has to do with nepotism, replacing governors with his own family members. Here we have two theological points that are sensitive. And remember that the caliph is not a theological position. He's supposed to be the sheikh, mm-hmm. The overseer of the tribe of God. And so two things have happened already. First of all, he's changed his own title so that he's the successor of God, mm-hmm. making himself equal to Muhammad. And secondly, that he has toyed around with the Quran and come up with his version, which is to be the version for everybody. And one Friday during prayers, things got a little raucous, and somebody threw a stone and hit Uthman right in the head. This was a sign of things to come. Because all throughout the Muslim world, people who were upset began sending delegations to Mecca and Medina to Uthman to complain about the way things were going. I mean, remember, okay. It's his relatives that are doing this. And so from as far away as Egypt in the west and Iraq in the east, these delegations come together and they complain. And Uthman did not meet with them. Instead, what he did was he sent Ali. And Ali assured them that Uthman would address each and every one of their concerns. Well, he sure did. What he did was he sent messengers to each of the Amir, his relatives who are governors and generals of those areas, telling them, look, we've got some real rabble-rousers here. We've got some complainers. Here's a list of who they are. You take care of it, and you know what I mean. Oh. Except the messengers never made it to their destination. Instead, they were always, everywhere, captured by the delegations who had gone to complain, and they took their letters away from the messengers. They read the messengers, and so they returned right back to Medina. And this time, they found Uthman in his home. They stormed the home, broke in, and murdered him. Now here is a caliph murdered by Muslims. This is big stuff. Mm-hmm. Muslims don't kill Muslims, supposedly. Now, the first caliph, Abu Bakr, is immersed in wars and rebellions for 2.5 years, lopping off heads because of apostasy. Omar is murdered by his own slave after many, many wars. Uthman is killed by his own people. Things are not looking good for the beginnings of Islam. Many people rallied at this point to Ali, and which seems to be the natural thing to do. And they called for a revenge against those people who killed Uthman, because even if he was wrong and bad, you just don't kill the leader like that. And Ali refused to have anything to do with any of this. He simply said no. And there were people who were insistent, and they followed him even where he did not wish to go. They kind of forced the hand, and they're known as the Shia to Ali. We get the word Shia from that. Okay, so these are the followers of Ali who persuade him through just force, persuade him to become the sheikh of the Ummah. He refuses the title caliph. He refuses the title. He is considered to be the fourth caliph, the fourth and last caliph, but he refuses the title itself. Instead, uses his position as sheikh to bring about reconciliation between those who had killed Uthman and those who insisted that Uthman was evil and needed to die. This becomes an important aspect of Islam also, that whole revenge thing. And so he even seeks forgiveness for the murderers. Now there's a new split. There are those who rally then to the daughter of Abu Bakr, Aisha. And these fear that Ali would mix politics in with theology and family, under the succession of Muhammad. And there's a good reason for that, because those theologians within Shiism, within the party of Ali, argue that the Ummah itself is a divinely established body. And so there is a mixing together of Muhammad, the blood of Muhammad through Fatima and Ali, and this succession that takes place, and that the Ummah is then to be rolled over by the holiest of persons. Okay? In this sense, they undo the early days of Islam, where the House of Islam was simply ruled over by the sheikh. Here instead now there's a sense of a theocracy involved, which had not been otherwise. If that's true, see, this party of Ali would argue, if that's true, if the House of Islam is a holy institution instituted by God, and it should be ruled over by the holiest of people, and Uthman was not holy by any means, therefore his murder was justified. Okay. It is, in fact, the grounding for the sense of an Islamic theocracy that we see today, for instance, in Iran, the Islamic Republic. Now, most Muslims rejected this argument, and they saw the Ummah is a great brotherhood of all Muslims, but not as a holy institution. Again, let me draw a parallel between what they were arguing about and what we understand through St. Paul in the church as being the mystical body of Christ, developed in one of its highest forms in the expression of Mystici Corporis by Pope Pius XII. We understand the church as being an extension of Christ. Mm-hmm. Christ is the head. We are the parts. There is something holy about the church. Not that all the members are always holy, but there is something holy about the church that is absolutely unique. And everything that the Second Vatican Council tells us about our role within the world and what we are to do to sanctify the world shows that the church is not just a human institution. That's what caused us to disagree with the Protestant reformers of the 16th century, where they and even some earlier theologians had argued that the church was a human institution. There was nothing divine about it, and it's a voluntary organization that people get together to worship. In Islam, then you have the same distinction, where the Shia will argue that the House of Islam is a holy body, not necessarily the mystical body of Muhammad, right, but in a sense a holy body instituted by God, as opposed to the vast majority of Sunni who recognize it as a historical entity. Okay. I don't want to carry those parallels too far because it just gets confusing. Anyhow, Obviously, there's going to be a lot of discussion, and a lot of this discussion is going to be quite violent. And Ali is going to refuse to use violence in order to persuade people where theological argument should be used instead. And he tried reconciliation, and one of his strongest followers finally felt that he had been deserted by Ali. And one day in the mosque, this man came up to Ali, drew out his sword, and shouted, "Judgment belongs to God, Ali, not to you." And with that, he hit him right across the head. Now, it was not a fatal wound. It was a good gash, but it was not a fatal wound, except that this sword was laced with poison. And so a few days later, 2 days later, actually, Ali died. So if you're looking at the line of succession, and when you think about the early popes, most of them died violently also, but they died during persecution, by the hands of the Romans. Here is quite a different story. This is a very hard history of the first four caliphs. And by the death of Ali, most of his followers, and remember that it was one of his followers who in fact had killed him, and then you have the defection of the Sunni. What then is to become of this House of Islam, which by now stretched all the way to Tripoli, into Tunis, all the way east to the borders of India? It's absolutely huge. And what happens is that there is one family that declares itself the leaders. They couldn't call themselves caliphs necessarily, but they set up a dynasty in Damascus. And the family is called the Umayyad. And for 90 years, they succeed in sort of controlling this huge Muslim empire. And then they're overthrown, except in one part of the Muslim world, and that's in the far westernmost part. They had spread across to Morocco, and then, remember, they came over Gibraltar, and then into Spain. And so those people, and they took the term caliphs, those caliphs of Spain, of the Caliphate of Cordoba, are themselves Umayyads. They're the leftovers of that dynasty. But the home ground of the dynasty was overthrown by a non-Arab group. These are the Abbasids, and these are actually Persian converts. It's not going to be the last time that Islam will be ultimately controlled. The destiny of Islam is going to be controlled by those who converted to it. But here we see the Persians, who were at first conquered by the Arabs, by Omar, now themselves are actually going to take over. They claimed to be descendants of Muhammad's uncle, Al-Abbas, and therefore are going to be supporters of the party of Ali, Shia, and they're going to move their capital out of Persia further west to Baghdad. And so this will be the grounding for the Abbasid dynasty. Again, there's going to be disagreements between the Abbasid, who are technically the controllers of this empire, but they're because they're Shia, they'll be in the minority. And they're going to turn to the Sunni. They're going to be massacres of the Umayyad leftovers. The Shia will be persecuted. They're going to run an inquisition out of Baghdad. Islam is going to be splintered then into a whole series of dynastic caliphates. I'd mentioned the one in Spain already, the Umayyads, and this was in 711 A.D. Over in Egypt, there's another group that's going to take over. They're going to call themselves the Fatimids, claiming a descendancy of Fatima. This is around 900 A.D. There's another group up in the north that's going to be converted around the Black Sea, they're going to be Turks. And in 980, the Seljuks are going to be converted. And their conversion will take place in 1038. And then after that, the Seljuks will be replaced by the Ottomans. It's the Ottomans that are going to ultimately bring about the fall of the Byzantine Empire. Mm-hmm. And Constantinople will be taken in 1453, turned into the city of Istanbul. And that dynasty will continue ruling until 1924.
Wow. So
it's quite recent history. I guess it's all involved with World War I and everything. But the point is that these Islamic dynasties that we just talked about, the splintered dynasties, whether they be in Spain, North Africa, Egypt, the Middle East, Persia, whatever, those are the ones that are going to be the dynasties that will be confronting Christianity in Spain during the Crusades, later in modern history, the Battle of Lepanto, those are going to be Turks, Belgrade, Vienna, again, Ottoman Turks. But behind the politics is this theocracy, is this concept, which is going to take a back seat to most of Islamic history. This theocracy concept is simply not going to be applied, or going to be able to be applied throughout most of Islamic history until you get to the 20th century. And then, once again, if you go back to those programs that we did at the end of our course, you're going to have people that come along like the Pakistani Maulana Maududi, if you remember that guy or not, Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian, the Islamic Revolution of the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, and then, of course, most recently, the Saudi Wahhabist Osama bin Laden. We just have a few minutes, I think. I'd like to go ahead and just read a little observation on the part of Reza Aslan, because he's quite critical of these three individuals. And all three of these individuals, by the way, whether it be Maududi or Qutb or Khomeini, or well, the four actually, Osama bin Laden, all four of them want to reinstitute an Islamic theocracy, which the reformers are going to be saying, no, we shouldn't be doing that. This is exactly what George Weigel is telling us, that Pope Benedict is going to help, through his dialogue, help lead Islam away from this abyss. But listen to what he says. He says, all three of these political leaders were, in one way or another, trying to restore some sense of the unity to which has become a deeply fractured worldwide community of Muslims, yet without either centralized political authority, that is to say, like a caliph. And if you listen to Osama bin Laden, he's talking about an establishment of a worldwide caliphate with himself as caliph, successor of Muhammad, right? So without that, or a centralized religious authority, like a pope, we've mentioned that, there's no hierarchy. The only institutions in the modern world that have any measure of success in uniting the Muslim community under a single banner have been the religious institutions of the ulama, the scholars. And whether that's being done at great universities or Islamic academies, or whether it's being done on the local level at the madrasas, okay, which have wreaked incredible havoc throughout the last number of years. Goes on to say, throughout Islamic history, as Muslim dynasties tumble over each other, Muslim kings are crowned and dethroned, and Islamic parliaments elect and dissolved, only the ulama, the scholars, in their capacity as the link to the traditions of the past, have managed to retain their self-imposed role as the leaders of Muslim society. As a result, over the past 15 centuries, Islam as we know it has been almost exclusively defined by an extremely small, rigid, and often profoundly traditionalist group of men who, for better or for worse, consider themselves to be the unyielding pillars upon which the religious, social, and political foundations of the religion rest. Then he says this: how they gain this authority and what they have done with it is perhaps the most important chapter in the story of Islam. So this is a Muslim himself, as he's looking at his own religion, and what he's seeing is that there is no unifying authority within Islam except for this small group of clerics who one wonders are able to be trusted at this point when they're preaching suicide bombing within their own mosques. And by no means are we saying that all ulamas are doing this.
Right.
But there's a significant number who are doing it, by the way, not going off and killing themselves, but getting young men and now young women to do this instead for them. If Islam is not going to mire itself into some kind of a medieval mindset, but instead is going to stand on its own, to recognize its own richness as a human community within a modern society, then it's going to have to learn how to do that. And George Weigel, in his book God's Choice, points out the way to do that is for Catholics, the Catholic Church, to walk hand in hand with Muslims, saying, look, we know what you're going through. We went through it ourselves. The last 500 years have not been pleasant. Let's save you 500 years of misery. Learn these lessons with us.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Wow, that's a lot to take in, Father.
Oh, it sure is.
Boy.
But now we turn our gaze to the north, and those darn Vikings are coming.
Oh, no.
Oh, no. Help me.
Okay.
So that's what we'll be talking about next week.
All right. Well, that sounds good. Be interesting. We'll shift to the north a bit.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Father, can we close with a prayer and
Sure
a blessing?
Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.